Let's start with the USMCA, that successor agreement to Nafta. We now have it passed by the House. Give us a sense of what will be different about our trade with Canada, with Mexico, once this goes into effect.
Several things, Dave, will be different. First of all, the farmers will be helped because those two countries, Canada and Mexico, are our number 1 and number 3 markets for agricultural exports. And there have been problems with our exports imposed by the countries. Particularly Canada has been very restrictive of our wheat and very restrictive of our dairy. So that's one thing. The more important thing in some ways are the new rules of origin, which will guarantee many more automotive jobs coming back to the U.S. that had been sent overseas by the poorly drafted rules of origin in the original Nafta. We believe there'll be at least 75,000 new jobs created in automotive and a total of at least 175,000 in all sectors of the economy.
So, Mr. Secretary, give us a sense, as best you understand it. Once this goes into effect, the new USMCA, will there be more trade with Canada and Mexico or less? Because we have Senator Pat Toomey, Republican from Pennsylvania, who's come out and said, we think this is actually going to be trade restrictive rather than trade enhancing. What do you think?
I think he's simply wrong. I just don't think he understands the details of the agreement. I think he's simply wrong.
So you expect there to be more trade as a practical matter. Is there a danger, in your view, about postponing the Senate ratification of this agreement? Because as we know, Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, said we're going to wait until after a trial, if and when it happens in the Senate. As time goes on, is there a chance for various people on both sides to sort of find problems with the deal?
Oh, I don't think anybody will find problems. You saw the overwhelming bipartisan support for the deal in the House. I think there were only, 14 people voted against, so it was a landslide. And we knew it would be. The whole issue was getting Speaker Pelosi to be willing to let it come to a vote. The Senate will pass it overwhelmingly, and Senator Toomey is in a very, very small minority.
Did the Democrats improve it? We had Speaker Pelosi say that they made some changes and then actually got better. Do you agree with her?
There were some marginal changes in the enforcement mechanisms for labor and for the environment. But even without those last-minute little changes, this agreement is far better on labor and the environment than anything we've ever had in a trade agreement. Especially, it's much better than anything that was in the old NAFTA.
We're talking with Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Mr. Secretary, you just made a very important point that the provisions in here are better than we've ever had in any trade agreement. Will this now be a template for the administration as it negotiates future trade deals? What are the critical elements you say, we've done it there, we can do it here?
Yes, that's a very good point, and it's a very true point. The very fact that we had a specific provision saying that a certain percentage of all the imports from Canada and Mexico into the U.S. had to be at $16 an hour average factory workers' pay. That's about 4 times what Mexican workers are being paid. So the practical net effect of it was to assure that a good portion of the product brought back into NAFTA would be made in the U.S. That's a totally different concept, not only from any U.S. trade agreement. I'm not aware of it in any trade agreement that any country has had.
Secretary Ross, something else that appears to be going to happen in January is a signing of what we've called the Phase 1 of a U.S. China trade deal. I'm told there's something like an 86-page document, but we haven't seen the text yet. Why is that? When will we see the text and know exactly what's in that deal?
Well, we have had described to you by U.S. Trade Rep Bob Lighthizer what's in the deal. What's going on right now is a normal process in that trade agreements are initially written with the U.S. in English. Now it has to be translated into Chinese and then the Chinese language version has to be conformed to the U.S. one. That's what's taking the time, and it's time well spent because it was a long, hard negotiation to get to this point. We want to make sure there's no confusion going forward.
No question, it looks like it's been a long, hard negotiation. That's certainly the way it's looked from the outside. At the same time, to what extent is the phase one, if I can call it this, sort of the old trade issues, things like agricultural products, manufacturing products, and yes, currency, transparency, things like that, as opposed to some of the 21st century issues like intellectual property, like artificial intelligence, like high tech?
Right. Well, that was deliberate. The idea was to deal mainly with trade, current trade, in this phase one agreement. This is not the final total agreement. This is just phase one. So we wanted to deal particularly with agriculture, which has been so unfairly penalized by the Chinese in retaliation for our Section 301 tariffs on them. So one was agriculture. Two was non-agriculture, other industrial products. The total of agriculture and industrial is around $100 billion per year. That's a lot. That's a 0.5 percentage point on the whole economy. So it's a huge improvement in all sectors of the economy immediately. Now, we certainly want to deal with the forced profit technology transfers, the unfair limitation of market access, theft of intellectual property, that whole panoply of technologically oriented problems that we've had with China. But the idea was get this first phase in, get it going, and build confidence toward the more difficult and more complicated issues. Those issues, these high-tech issues, very likely will require legislation through the Congress in China. That's a difficult thing to get a country to do, has to be done very carefully, has to be done very meticulously. Third is the enforcement. And there's a very good enforcement mechanism in this phase one, and I'm sure something like it will carry over to the subsequent phases. What it basically says in phase one, if the Chinese do not live up to their agreement, then there's a 90-day process of consultation, at the end of which, if we're not satisfied, we can impose unilaterally retaliation on them. Most likely that would mean raising some tariffs on some products or adding products to the tariff list. The first time there's been that kind of an enforcement mechanism in any trade agreement.
We're talking with U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Secretary Ross, related to China, although apparently not part of phase one, is Huawei and the sensitive issues there. Where are you right now? Because you have to approve the waivers there. Where is that process?
Well, we put Huawei on the entity list some while ago, and what that means is any product that is on the normal restricted list, namely because it could be militarily sensitive or otherwise adverse to our national policy. Anybody wanting to export any of those products needs to get a special license from the Commerce Department. And there's a whole process for applying for that and then granting it. Way over 200 such applications have been submitted, and we've been gradually responding to them. We're being very cautious about granting exclusions because this is a very, very important and very sensitive area. But we have been granting some licenses for things that are not endangering our policy or our security.
Mr. Secretary, let's talk about steel for a moment, because U.S. Steel is in the news today as they announce that they're going to have layoffs, they're going to cut back on their dividends, they're going to have some losses. One of President Trump's priorities was really helping the U.S. steel industry in part through tariffs. And in fact, there have even been tariffs announced for Argentina and Brazil. I don't believe they've gone into effect yet. Is that policy working? Is it helping the U.S. steel industry the way it was expected? And if not, is there a plan B?
You know, if you read the whole announcement from U.S. Steel, what's really happening is the plant that they're closing down has historically been a very high-cost facility. It was built something like in 1935. Meanwhile, they've been investing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in new, more modern facilities, particularly in Pennsylvania. So what's happening is they're rationalizing a bit their production so that they will be more fully competitive in the future as we continue to go forward. They also will be cooperating with GM and Ford, both of whom are adding lots of workers in those very same geographies. And the hope is that a lot of the workers temporarily displaced by U.S. Steel will find employment, hopefully, at Ford or GM or other parts of the manufacturing industry.
So do I take it from that in your view and the president's view, the steel approach is the right approach and it's working the way the administration wanted it to work when you put the tariffs into place?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear what you were saying.
What I was asking is whether you and the president believe that the steel policy of the administration is working. That is to say, when you put the tariffs into effect, this is the expected result.
Well, the expected result that has happened is that there has been much more capital invested in both the steel and the aluminum industries. And on balance, they both have added jobs. Those were our objectives, to get capital invested so that those industries would be globally competitive and, on balance, to have more jobs than before.
And should we expect tariffs to go into effect on steel from Argentina and Brazil in the near future?
Well, Argentina and Brazil have been announced by the president as targets for tariffs. I think you're aware that they have been on a quota system in any event, so it's not that they have not been without restriction. It's just the question, is the most effective way to do that quotas, or is the most effective way tariffs?